a longtime fan and supporter of the channel on Patreon, ODS, wrote in asking for recommendations of what he should read about the history and politics of China. This is going to be a short answer because I think the vast majority of what's available in the English language is complete garbage. And it's not just that I wouldn't recommend it. The general history books on China, I often have to urge people, warn people not to read them because they're really, really misleading. If you're not going to get into very specific, single topic academic articles that are very hard to find anyway. I mean, there is some good scholarship out there on history and politics of China, but any book you pick up that just says China on the cover, or the history of China, China 1300 to 1900, anything like this. Of course, there are some that cover 5,000 years. It's all terrible. Why is it terrible? Yes, some of it is propaganda. More often, what you're dealing with is boosterism. Boosterism is different from propaganda. I remember there was one book called The Shorter Science and Civilization of China. So shorter it was a condensed version of a longer work called Science and Civilization in China. Somewhat famous. And the whole book just consisted of the most, laughable attempts to bend over backwards and convince you that China was the most wonderful, most inspirational civilization of the history of the world. Even things that were terrible about it were wonderful. You can read that sort of really embarrassing thing coming out of the Muslim world every so often too. I remember a book that was on the history of science under Islam, where the authors, you sort of read this, it's like worse. It's worse than the worst communist propaganda, but it's neither pro-communist nor anti-communist. It's just boosterism. It's just trying to tell you that everything in ancient China was wonderful. And of course, we would never tolerate this for medieval Europe. We wouldn't even tolerate this for antebellum, North America, United States of America or something, Eesh. Yeah, there's a lot of complete garbage out there on library shelves and store shelves under the heading of Chinese history and politics and civilization. And the situation is not getting better, it's getting worse. As bad as that book was that I just mentioned as an example, when it was published, there was real money to be made in publishing nonfiction. You could put together a proposal and go to a publisher and say, hey, I'm going to do the research and writing. I'm going to give you a book that says China in big letters, whatever it is, China 1500 to 1900, or China from the Han Dynasty to present. And that book really had the chance to make a lot of money. And today, if you go out into the world expecting to find a good book on a topic, you should ask yourself first, who paid to publish it? Increasingly, nonfiction publishing is a charity, not a for-profit business. And if there isn't some foundation or some government interest, if there isn't someone losing money to make the book happen, it's very likely it won't happen at all. If you want a worrying example, let me ask you something. Who abolished slavery first, Europe or China? Have you seen any books in English on the history of the abolition of slavery in China? No? Research hasn't been done in English, and it's never going to be done. In my lifetime, there will be no groundbreaking new book published on the abolition of slavery in China, and I'm not going to write it myself either. And this financial constraint is crucial to understanding that. Okay? So if these warnings haven't been stated, this young man asked me for a recommendation. I'm going to give one that's about ancient or pre-modern China and one that's about the politics of modern China. In terms of the wonder that was China before the revolution, before modern and Western technology arrived, what I recommend is a work of fiction called The Water Margin, a work of traditional Chinese literature. So Water Margin in English is also known as Outlaws of the Marsh. This gives the title All Men Are Brothers. I've definitely seen Heroes of the Marsh. In any case, Shui Hu Zhuan is translated into English as The Water Margin. It's a terrible translation of the title. And it is available in several different English translations. Why is this book so important and useful? Why would I recommend this to someone? who's interested in the history of China, whereas I'm warning against badly biased history books. And again, some of those history books are biased because they're pro-communist. Some of them are biased because they're anti-communist. But some of them are just of poor quality. All right, let's be clear. But yes, within the last 50 years, the main spark illuminating English language interest in China has been communism, including the disaster of communism. But a great many books, including books professors have handed to me in a university context, are written with an overt pro-communist bias, and they are not worth reading for that reason unless you're interested in research into the nature of communist propaganda. And it may not be obvious to you as a non-specialist or an outsider that what you're reading is communist propaganda, or it may not be obvious until it's too late. Years later, you look back and realize, wow, that was a really biased version of the history of China. So, however, history can be biased in more ways than one. It can be bad in more ways than one. In terms of an introduction to the wonder that was China, The Water Margin is a work of literature, it's a work of fiction, written by someone who is profoundly discontent with his own culture and society. Right at the beginning of the book, right in the first couple volumes, shall we say, you have a depiction of how the prison system works, and the prison system is corrupt. You have a depiction of how the Buddhist monasteries work, and the Buddhist monasteries are shown to be flagrantly corrupt. You have a depiction of how torture works, and people paying bribes to the torturer to alleviate their suffering. You get this very strange step-by-step analysis of that society and the author's view of what's wrong with it. And from this author's perspective, practically everything is wrong with it. Now, you might think I'm describing some work of carefully studied social realism. This is, in fact, an adventure story with elements of magic, elements of kung fu and sword fighting and swashbuckling, you might say. However, both the author's interest and my interest, at least, in reading it today, is the way in which it carefully depicts how that society works, both in terms of organization and even the technology that define daily life. So when I vaguely said before you figure out how the court system works, you get descriptions of how someone would sit down and pay a scribe to record their sworn testimony to present to the court. You see the way in which that society relied on handwritten documents. People didn't have identity cards to prove who they were. You would show up and present something in writing, and the person receiving it would have to scrutinize it and confirm that the handwriting in what you've presented matches the handwriting with the governor from that province. Like, well, I'm familiar with this governor's handwriting, and they would really have to watch for fraud and what have you. And again, the author is very interested in the way in which fraud vitiates the whole society, the dishonesty, bribery, fraud. He's very interested in showing the police and the courts as being morally no better than the robbers, the bandits, and so on. It's very interesting. It's very careful studying this way. Now, I have not read the whole of The Water Margin. I think I read the first 4 volumes of my translation, and I forget if it was 4 volumes out of 9. I forget how many there were, but it was a long, long work. And each volume I read was about the size of a novel. In terms of understanding how China worked, the social inequality and the different forms of cooperation between people, even religion, the way in which Buddhism and Taoism and vegetarianism were part of daily life, there's a lot there that you can learn from reading The Water Margin. And it's presented in a very unpretentious way, because it's presented to an audience that's already very familiar with that social setting. But for a modern person to even understand how a restaurant worked in that period, there are a lot of mechanisms of daily life described. How farming worked, how the economy worked under feudalism, and as I say, the legal system, the political system, how the land was governed, and how people on a face-to-face level interacted with their oppressors, I can say. The book is written in a way that's very interesting. Now, as I say, I didn't finish it, and I may just be too busy to ever return to and finish reading The Water Margin. It's also possible it would become less and less interesting to me as it goes on, because in those early books you get all that description of how society works, and I don't know where it goes from there. I don't know. I mean, once you get past volume 3 or volume 4, maybe you've hit a point of diminishing returns where there isn't anything really new. I don't know. Or maybe there really is a lot more that's valuable later on. But, it's a book that also scholarly progress has been made in identifying the correct conclusion of the book in Chinese. And to my knowledge, the correct conclusion has never been translated into English. So part of me wanted to wait for a new translation in future that would bring together the findings of recent scholarship and really give a definitive and correct ending. So, because I do wonder, in terms of the author's intent, the artistic intent, and the moral of the story, I don't know if I'd really want to read it with the current bad ending, an ending that we now know is not really what the author intended. So, The Water Margin is very, very instructive in all those ways. And from my perspective, the descriptions of sword fights are of absolutely no interest. But if you find them entertaining, good for you, because you'll be learning, and at the same time, you'll be entertained. At the opposite end of the historical and political spectrum, the book that people will be talking about in the year 2020, 2021 is the English translation of How the Red Sun Rose by Gao Hua. So How the Red Sun Rose was published in the year 2000 in Chinese, but it only emerged in English translation in 2019. So it's definitely still a new thing, sending shockwaves. I have to tell you, I feel I already know a lot about this book because I have read other works that were influenced by it. I have not seen the English, nor have, of course, I haven't read it in Chinese either. It's a book that fundamentally shifted analytical attention from the post-1949 period of communism to what happened in the formative years between, say, 1930 and 1945, so to be clear, this is not about the foundation of communism in China. This is not about the creation of communism in China. It's really about the way in which communism was recreated and redefined in one place at one time under the leadership of Mao Zedong. How Mao Zedong established his own authority and the way in which his version of communist doctrine was significantly different from the orthodox Russian version of communism. How that was first articulated, and how Mao Zedong first put himself in a position of unquestioned authority, and how Mao Zedong first started carrying out purges, massacres, if you like, persecution, trial, and massacres of political enemies as part of this snowballing of his unique political authority. So I haven't read the book yet. I will at least make time to look at the book, to evaluate the book. My apprehension is that while this book was intended to demolish a certain myth about the history of the Communist Party, the origin of the Communist Party, and it's meant to demolish certain myths about the purges themselves, persecution and mass murder under Chinese communism, I'm very apprehensive that it actually creates another myth that's put in its place. And even though this book is considered anti-communist, it's banned in communist China, it's illegal in communist China, gets printed in Chinese in Hong Kong and then mysteriously distributed, I don't know, out of the back of someone's car trunk or something in China. It's contraband in China, we could say this. Even though the book is considered anti-communist and a challenge to the Communist Party, nevertheless, I'm deeply apprehensive that in effect it's not anti-communist enough, that it is in its way a new mise en valeur that it's I'm concerned that it creates another myth. And again, I've read this book. I have not read this book, but I have read other works influenced by it, and I can see its influence across the board in Chinese discussion of Chinese politics. And I think there are actually important questions to pose, challenging this idea that it's really that period before 1945 that defined all these elements. Then obviously you're demoting or disregarding some other important elements of history, that some important things maybe were improvised at a later date, developed in some substance. So look, important, interesting questions. So there you go. The situation with English language publications on Chinese history and politics is bad, and it's only going to get worse. A lot of people ask as a sort of snide joke, what's the point of studying a subject like this in university? And believe me, this is a question that gets put to me and it gets put to my girlfriend also. What's the point of studying something in university that can't possibly earn any money? It really becomes a much more profound question if we look at the body of scholarship and realize that in each generation, this has been transformed again and again with the assumption that publishing groundbreaking, exciting new books about history and politics could earn money. And in a field like this now, that has disappeared. So what we're talking about here is not the progress of science. If you invent a slightly better light bulb, you can be sure millions of dollars will be generated by it. Very trivial improvements in science and technology can correspond to massive amounts of money being unleashed for the creators and manufacturers. Very profound improvements in the writing of history, very important and substantive improvements in the understanding of politics, now corresponds to absolutely no money, no wealth being generated for anyone. And of course, this is especially true if you're talking about books written in English about China. If you're talking about books written in Italian about Italy, maybe there's a little tiny bit of a financial incentive. So we definitely need to move beyond a sort of snide set of recriminations about the uselessness of academia in generating money in people's lives and move on to a productive critique of how scholarship is supposed to work, not even at a break-even basis, but at a loss.